Bryon Kroger.
Today I'm going to talk about how we smuggled DevOps into the world's largest bureaucracy. That is the Department of Defense, literally by dollars, by number of people, by pretty much every metric, the largest bureaucracy on earth. Talk about why we did it, right? Simon Sinek, a huge fan, got to start with why. We'll talk about what we did, the crazy idea, the prototype, how we transferred it and scaled it up, how we did all of those things, and then I'll close with some big lessons learned. And this is a core practice talk, so the practice here is the practice of scaling or growing, as well as kind of a meta leadership practice. How do you lead digital transformation? So why we did it. As I mentioned, I was in the Air Force for the first 7 years of my Air Force career. I was this guy over here, a lot shorter hair back then, no facial hair. It wasn't that long ago, by the way. I only left in June, so quick transition, transformation maybe. But you know, for 7 years, I used really terrible software. We do not deliver great software to our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines out in the field. And in corporate America, the cost of delay, the cost of taking so long to deliver software is measured in dollars, right? You lose profits. In the Department of Defense, the cost is often lives, right? It's a completely different scenario. And meanwhile, when you have things like this going on and bad software that people are using to try to conduct these kind of operations, meanwhile, it's 8.5 average year cycle time. So to get a project from idea to requirements generated, to funded, to development done, tested, accredited, and fielded, 8.5 years for an average software program in the United States. 94% of those projects are behind schedule or over budget, and 40% never actually deliver a single thing to the field. And that's because while our airmen, soldiers, sailors, and Marines are out there doing their thing, procurement's back in the Pentagon doing this thing. This is the document they use to guide their procurement. I don't expect you to be able to read it, but my favorite part of this is actually up in the top right corner. It actually says that the defense acquisition system is so complex, it can't possibly be represented two-dimensionally, so you should go read all of these other documents, policies, procedures, and regulations. At the same time that they're doing that, software is eating the world, as Andreessen famously penned about 10 years ago. But for us, software is certainly eating the war. It's now the central differentiator on the battlefield. You talk about a platform like the F-35, it's just a giant computer with wings flying around the globe. And so we have to think differently about how we deliver software. Our service acquisition executive, the person that's in charge of all procurement for the Air Force, he says that it's actually not going to be taking down enemy aircraft systems that wins the next war. It's going to be strategic data collection. And on the operational side of our force, General Goldfein said something very similar. He said the next war won't be a war of attrition, it's going to be a war of cognition. And it's software on every device in every domain that's going to determine the course of that war. And so I decided the last place we want to be disrupted on the battlefield is on the battlefield, and that's where I came from, right? Like I was the airman that was out there doing targeting operations for 7 years, and I saw what happened when you deliver bad software. And so we decided we needed to transform. And I really started pushing this narrative inside the Air Force and the Department of Defense that we need to become a software company that fights wars. Kind of an interesting concept, much like many banks now are saying, we're not a bank, we are a software company that does banking, right? We're not an insurance company, we're a software company that does insurance. And so what we did, we started, you got to start with a good name. So a lot of people think this is a parsecs reference if you're a Star Wars nerd. First of all, that's a measure of time or distance, not time. So maybe the shortest point to get from your digital transformation, where you are today, to your digital transformation. But for us, it was really a smuggling route, right? Kessel Run is famously a smuggling route for spices. And so for us, it was how do we smuggle this into the Air Force? And we started with a small team, mission-focused team. You can see they're out here in Qatar. You talk about user interviews, right? That poses a challenge when your users are forward in the desert. And so not only are we doing remote interviews with people on a weekly basis, we try to get people out there so they can really empathize with the user and get them out there every other month, if not more frequently. But our first project, the first thing that we did, we actually wanted to build this cool mission planning application. Eric Schmidt famously goes out to Qatar and he sees this whiteboard and he says, "This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen." So we're talking Eric Schmidt of Google fame, right? And so we got a call, they said, "Pivot, you need to build a tanker planning application." What this pilot, and this is a pilot, by the way, who's been taken out of his jet to help plan all of the air-to-air refueling for the entire theater. And he's doing it on a whiteboard with these folks here. And we start with one project. I think what's really important about Kessel Run, before I talk about what we did with Jigsaw, is we really wanted to avoid the alignment trap. Most important thing you can do in a digital transformation. People like to come in and implement something like Scaled Agile Framework from the jump. Day one they have a product team of 8 people, but they also have 8 architects. More enterprise architects than you have software engineers. It's a problem. So we really wanted to focus on how do we establish continuous delivery first. Once we figure out continuous delivery, we can focus on alignment and getting more mission value by getting feedback and understanding cycle times. And so what we did, we basically recreated their whiteboard, but in a digital format. And it used to be that the planner would go up to the whiteboard, beautiful mind this big plan for the entire theater, and then they would yell back to, in the military we have funny terms for things. We have a gonculator, which is like the calculator inside the spreadsheet. So running a bunch of macros, and the guy that types the things into that, he's the gonker. So you shout across the room to the gonker, make sure all the fuel calculations are correct. That person shouts to the thumper because all his job is just to type that into the legacy systems, like data entry. And then you have a plan in 4 to 6 hours, but something changes, you have to start over. And something always changes. Conflict is dynamic, and so you're just planning all day, every day. Instead, we give them the Tanker Planner tool. We have one planner, so 2 people that don't have to be part of this mission anymore, and they're able to generate the plan in minutes, and if something changes, good to go. We can just make the change on the fly. And we continue to iterate on that, make it a little bit more advanced. It's now a touchscreen enabled, and what you can see is actually their whiteboard is right behind this screen, so kind of a fun image. But what's really cool is the return on investment for something like this. So you're picking your MVP. It's really important to pick something that you can use to tell a story. We actually got really lucky with this one. So we spent $1.5 million. It took us 120 days to do all of the development for this. So came up with an idea, did all the development. Meanwhile, we had a pivot in the middle of this that I mentioned. And 120 days later, we had this product live on our secret network doing real operations for the actual warfight that was going on in the Middle East. So something like that used to take, if I'm being very generous, about 5 years. It immediately started generating $214,000 a day in fuel savings because we were able to ground one tanker. So it paid for itself in a week, but another way to look at that when you talk about that's an opportunity cost. We would have missed out on $391 million of fuel savings. And that's just using the MVP numbers. Over time, we kept iterating on this product. We can now save 2 tankers, so now $428,000 a day in fuel savings. But the tagline here is really important, right? A lot of people say we can't afford this digital transformation. But if you start quantifying the cost of delay, how much it's costing you to go slow, the truth is you can't afford waterfall. It's eating your lunch. So you have this MVP and then you're like, what do I do next? This is the part where a lot of people, their digital transformation sputters out because you can produce a bunch of MVPs and still not move the needle for your enterprise. And by the way, those numbers sound really big. To the Air Force, those are rounding errors. Like $389 million is like it's a rounding error. It doesn't even register to some people. So you have to start figuring out how to move from local optimization to global optimization. So we broke down our enterprise using things like event storming and figuring out where we can bite off chunks of this problem. Where are the bottlenecks? Where can we move the needle and provide the most value? And so you can see I've roughly outlined here some of the applications. We kept building and building. We actually scaled from 1 product team to 28 product teams in a little less than 2 years, from 15 people to about 550 people when I left. And there's this interesting thing too that, eventually you start to get into these, everybody wants to do AI, machine learning, blockchain, and they want to do that on day one, right, of the digital transformation. Almost all the value is up here. It's just like helping people do their jobs better. And eventually you get to the point though where you can start tackling these things. So I always like to say, we did get to the point where we now have an event stream, we're doing optimization off that event stream. We're able to do optimization inside of the tanker plan that I mentioned, employing a lot of AI and machine learning in those instances. But that comes much later in your journey. If you try to focus on that early, you won't actually get the user value that continues to drive your transformation. But you have to get it into the hands of users. And so path to production is this thing that people often wait way too long to do. So I would say establish this as early as you can in your journey. On our very first application, we started with this and we just kept expanding it and automating, right? Anytime there was toil for a developer to get into the production environment, automate that. And eventually it started out as a community product and then it became its own product in and of itself that we think of just like any other product, but the users are other developers. And that's important because this becomes a critical dependency for your development teams. And so you want to practice user-centered design more than anywhere else in your system. But what you see here is our security pipeline and our automated release pipeline. We actually centralized those. And so that's what allows us to go as fast as I mentioned, right? It used to take, even once you were done developing, it took you a year to get through testing and another year to get through cybersecurity and field. Now we can do all of that in minutes. Right? But there's a lot that goes into that, and there's a lot of compliance baked in. And so the thought of giving the team control over that compliance pipeline is a little bit unnerving in the military. So the reason we were able to go fast is because we actually built this product for compliance. Right? We treated them as a user of this product to help them do their jobs, to help make their lives easier. And I think that's a really important empathy that's required to get transformation inside of a large enterprise when you have such a highly regulated space. And then ultimately you need a platform to deploy to. And I like to say that platform as a service is a prerequisite for DevOps outcomes inside of enterprise transformation. There's no way to do it without PaaS. I'll talk about why that is. It's below the value line, but for us, we use various cloud infrastructure. We use AWS GovCloud, some Azure, and then a lot of on-premise vSphere for our secret and top secret environments. And if I didn't mention that before, we're deploying from an unclassified environment to a classified secret, top secret environment, and we're able to do that in less than an hour, which is just unprecedented. It blew people's minds. And at the end of the day, the thing that we were really striving for is, it's one thing to get compliance down, and you're like, oh, I can deploy in a week now. When you want to get to minutes, you need continuous authority to operate. You have to remove any manual reviews from the path to production. That doesn't mean there aren't manual reviews. You can do spot checking on the back end. You can and should, in fact we do, pen testing on the back end. But initially, quality and security are usually done right here, right? After build, before you go to the fielding step. And what we started doing is walking quality and security, right? The shift left. Left is a made up thing if you don't start alleviating other dev concerns. And the only way you can do that is through automation, right? People are not gonna practice good security if they can't figure out how to get their product into production, right? That takes primacy. And so making it easier to get into production frees up developers' time to think about security more in the build phase. And then we can even start walking quality and security back into our hiring practices, our training and growth practices, and make sure that we're really equipping this. But then you can start moving right as well, where you build quality and security into the actual release pipeline itself, and then getting it into monitoring, right? And this is where you can advance your test-driven development practice, which I know everybody in DTE knows and loves, but this is where you can take that and advance it to monitoring-driven development and really complete the feedback loop from production, what you're really seeing in operations. And then you got to have a lab, and you guys know all about having labs. You have several of them, but for us, this was a very unique concept. Most development would happen either inside the contractor's facility or on an airbase, which makes it really hard to get the kind of talent that we needed. So we built a lab in downtown Boston. You can see that the Air Force Base is way out here. This is a map, the tech ecosystem of Boston, which is the 4th largest tech hub in the world, actually. And being down here gives you access to not only talent and the kind of environments that talented people want to work in, but it also gives you close proximity to the tech ecosystem and doing tech exchanges and lunch and learns and all those things, and incredibly important. And then there's like little things too. You know about being inside of the Ben. Likewise, inside of the military, you're inside of the NIPRNet. It's really hard to get unclassified internet access on a base and use modern tooling and all the things that you need to do this. And so, ton of advantages to building a little island of innovation. The most important though is the cultural barrier that it creates as you're trying to grow. The culture transformation is the hardest piece, and you need a barrier, you need a safe space to be able to grow that culture without interference from the outside organization. And then last but certainly not least, you have to have procurement involved, and you can't scale beyond the initial MVPs. You can't really achieve success until budgeting and contracting and the requirements process change. And fun fact is Kessel Run, I said I left operations. I was mad at the software that was being built. I tried for a while to influence it from ops, from the business side, but I couldn't. And so I hung my hat on operations. It's almost unheard of. I had maybe the coolest job in the Air Force, and I left it to go do procurement. So I applied for a career change. I went to procurement, and Kessel Run was launched inside of procurement. So it's not an operational unit. It's not inside of IT. We actually did it from inside procurement because I felt that was the only real way to change the system. And so it's just a really interesting thing that I like to say is our procurement team now, our budget and finance team, our contracting team, they do daily stand-ups, they do IPMs, they do all of the things that all of our development teams are doing. And I think it's a really important thing about scaling this inside of a large enterprise is you have to bring everybody along for the journey, every aspect of the business. This becomes your balance team. And if you can get unity of command of this balance team of procurement, labs, and platform, all under one roof, at a really low level in the organization, that's what allows you to really move fast and be able to scale quickly. This ultimately though, what we were able to achieve, 28 balance team, 8,000 active users, which doesn't sound a lot in the commercial space, but inside of the military, it's a lot more high impact, high profile work that has to be done by a small number of people. So 8,000 is actually quite an achievement. 124 days average to get to MVP. Almost all teams are on a weekly release cadence to prod, so push to prod every week on a set day, and we can push to prod. That actual lead time is less than an hour to our classified environments. We have the continuous authority to operate continuous delivery on 3 different networks. In 2019 so far, I just checked in, they have over 300 deployments with daily deployments going to production. Ultimately, continuously delivering war-winning software that our airmen love. And you can see the 3 practices built in here of XP, of lean product management, and user-centered design, right? And that's the mission of Kessel Run. But the strategic outcomes for your organization and the things that you want to message to leadership is it's really about building a capacity for continuous delivery. It's not even about the apps. It's about your ability to respond. And so you want to be optimized for change and have sustained velocity, right? A lot of agile transformations start out and they get really high velocity, maybe even higher than what you see inside of DTE when you're doing paired programming and test-driven development, where the ramp-up time is much more gradual, right? But you hit sustained velocity in that way of working. A lot of agile teams that don't follow those practices hit really high peak velocity and they come back down because they don't have clean code. You don't have clean code, it means that you can't safely make changes and you get to a point in your system where you don't have sustained velocity. So the ultimate goal then is that Kessel Run can now sense and respond to conflict in any domain, anytime, anywhere. It's not the software that we go to war with that's going to win. It's the software that we make in response to the enemy on the battlefield because we can never anticipate what that's going to be. So how did we do it? This is the core practice part of this. I love to tell the story of NUMMI as a good starting point. If you're not familiar, Toyota wanted to get into the American auto manufacturing market, and of course GM wanted to learn how Toyota was just blowing them out of the water in terms of quality and production times. And so they did a joint their worst performing plant in the United States, the Fremont assembly line, that they had recently closed the doors on. It was so bad that people were actually drinking on the job, gambling on the job, putting Coke bottles in doors and sealing them up, sabotaging the vehicle so it would rattle when you bought it. And you think about these people and you say, what kind of culture is that? What kind of values and attitudes do these people have? And GM said, hey, Toyota, we're going to throw you a bone here. We're going to help you take on the union so that you can get new workers. And Toyota actually said, no, that's okay. We'll take all the original workers. Within a few months, it was the highest performing auto manufacturing plant in the United States, one that GM was never able to replicate the quality and speed of in the entire time until it shut its doors during the crisis in 2008. Fun fact, it's now the site of Tesla manufacturing, the Fremont assembly. But how does Toyota do that? How do they take people that all of us onlookers would say, those people have awful morals, values, attitudes, and beliefs, and turn them into people that are one of the most high-functioning assembly lines in the world? Well, the old way that we think about doing this, and most enterprises are guilty of this, I know the Air Force certainly is we're going to tell you about the values and attitudes you should have and the culture you should have. We're going to make promises about what will happen if you do those things. Like, hey, if you adopt lean and agile, here's what the result will be. And that never actually changes anybody's minds, right? There'll be some early adopters that will believe in anything, just like early tech adopters, and they'll jump on board. But you can't scale that. The way that Toyota figured this out is like, hey, come work with us. We're going to show you a new way. We're going to immerse you in. Show up to labs, and they hate pair programming. So this is like a well-known thing, right? But over time, they start to see the results of working this new way, and that's what starts to change their values and attitudes. That's what changes the culture, right? It's a show me, right? Seeing is believing. And so Toyota was very good at this, about bringing people into an immersive environment. And having worked extensively, you all with Pivotal Labs, it's the same model when you think about it. Hey, come work with us, right? We're not going to talk about it. We're just going to do it. And once you see the results, it'll change your mind. And so how do you apply that to cloud native transformation, right? Slightly different. We're not talking about assembly lines here. You have people, process, and technology, also on the assembly line. But the slight difference here is, where's the Toyota production system that you're going to immerse yourself into? Well, you can use services like Pivotal Labs, but eventually you leave, and then you're trying to scale this inside of your organization. What do you do? Well, I just said you have to change what we do. Changing what we do implies that we have opinions about process and technology that are already in place that we can bring people into and start working, right? And so the leader of a digital transformation has to make really informed decisions about what to do here so that we can change the way we work and change people's values and attitudes and beliefs. That's how you scale this. But that's not as easy as it sounds. I think we all generally agree on the practices. All those buzzwords, everybody uses the same ones. Yeah, we need to do Agile. Yeah, we need to do DevOps. Maybe some of them don't understand what it actually means. But general agreement on the process side of the house. On the technology side of the house is where everybody gets hung up. You spend so much time obsessing over technology and getting in what I call technology wars, where you bring your senior engineer, I bring my senior engineer, and we talk about the differences between Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry and whatever else. Nobody pays attention to the real problem here, which is, for enterprise transformation, platform is below the value line. It is. I will challenge anybody. I'll stay after. We can hash it out. It is below the value line. At Netflix, it is not. If Netflix makes a change at the OS level that gets them 1 millisecond faster response time, it results in hundreds of millions of value, right? Revenues, huge revenue boosts. Inside of most large enterprises, people can't even do their jobs today. So the real value is in providing mission capabilities. Developers can't do their job today. So that's where the big value is in terms of the next most valuable thing, the lean thing to do. Things below the layered abstraction of apps and data, they just really don't matter for you yet today. And they won't for a long time in your transformation. And so that's why I say platform as a service is a prerequisite for DevOps outcomes, because you want to spend as little here as possible below the value. Little, I mean, not so time and head count, which is actually the most precious thing. And so a few things to think about. You got to start with the customer experience and work your way backwards towards the technology. And so when you're making those technology decisions, it's not about what's the most advanced platform, which I don't even know what that really means. It just really means what's the technology that the most advanced organizations are using. But what the most advanced organizations are using might have a different cost. Think about cost to operate the platform. That's always the obvious one. But the problem is we're saying we need digital transformation, which implies there's a wall between dev and ops. And who do they go ask about the technology? They go ask ops. Who does ops care about? Hopefully in the future, when we're a DevOps organization, they'll say devs. But the truth is, when you're starting this journey, dev hates ops and ops hates dev. It's just the way it is. And so ops gives a very ops-centric answer. And they also aren't used to cloud-native operations. So they really only think about the day one cost. Not very many are experienced with what the day two costs are. So for all of these costs I'm listing out, it's about day one and day two. And you have to consider your future complexity in day two ops. What's patching and upgrade going to look like when you have 3,000 workloads? Cost to develop on the platform, though, the forgotten thing, the thing ops usually doesn't care about is if I go lower in an abstraction level, that means if I have 20 story points a week to work with, and my dev team spends 10 story points a week managing a Kubernetes cluster, that's 10 story points that we can't do on feature development at the mission capability level. And so there's a cost then, a trade-off for developing on the platform. And then the one that nobody ever really talks about is the cost of compliance. We're in large enterprises, there are a lot of controls, a lot of regulations, and so building those into your platform can be more expensive depending on the abstraction layers that you're dealing with. So taken together, making smart choices here is what frees up the resources you need for your transformation. And people make really bad technology that they can't manage, especially on day 2, and it eats all of their resources and they can't grow the transformation. Of course, then everybody says, oh my gosh, platform as a service, you're going to have that vendor lock with Red Hat or Pivotal or whoever it might be. This is so frustrating to me. So Oracle has like true vendor lock, which is like IP related vendor lock. Literally, it's like, I own your data now, all your data. That's very different than what you're dealing with in cloud native, right? I run from the people that say like, oh, that cloud vendor lock. All of the major offerings now, there's no IP lock-in. There's only migration lock, and you can have more or less of that depending on the abstraction, right? But I don't view that as a problem. So if I decide to use somebody else's work, somebody else's abstractions in the stack, because you have no choice. The tech stack is the tech stack. Either you build it or somebody else does. But if I buy somebody else's work, then I have to know that if I decide not to use that product anymore, all the work that I forewent, I now have to do, or I have to replace with somebody else's product. And that there's always a cost to move from one technology to another. Even if you're using open source, that's the case. And in fact, I like to say in government, the worst lock-in is actually with GOTS, government off-the-shelf software, right? Because it's so bad, the dependencies are so high, the way that it's architected, that actually has the most lock-in. And so it doesn't really matter if a commercial vendor owns something or you own it or it's open source. Just pay attention to how much it's going to cost you to migrate. And you should pay attention to that cost, but it's not lock-in. It's just a cost of doing business. The other thing is, you learn that Agile doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. Definitely a problem. Everybody in the Air Force said they're doing Agile. I'm sure it's the same here. A lot of what I see would be giant safe diagrams where I like to say, in the DoD we don't always do Agile, but when we do, we like it to look like waterfall. That's mean to safe. Safe can actually be applied really well. I think the problem is that most people that adopt it are adopting it because they don't actually want to change, which is the real problem. It's not safe, it's the attitudes of the people. But you have to learn how to communicate with all of these different parties effectively, and it's not going and bashing safe. So I say that here, but not elsewhere. So I like to say, take your thing, whatever it is, especially the diagrams that you've come up with. At Kessel Run, we use things like value stream mapping, impact. Came up with a flow for how does this match up to a traditional enterprise process or what it might look like. And then let's map it to their actual processes, right? Take your thing, make it look like their thing. So this is our requirements process, JSIDs in the DoD. So we mapped that out to the things we were doing, all the way out to OKRs. The planning, programming, and budgeting and execution, that happens in our OKR process. How many resources are we going to allocate to a given objective and key results? And then all of this from scoping, DNF, the things that you're all used to, building an MVP, iterating on it, that's our defense acquisition system. And I can actually map it out to the milestones. And when we started doing things like this, the narrative really changed and took off. Before it was, you can't scale this, you're doing this bespoke thing inside of the enterprise, we have processes, we have regulations, and they're like, oh, I see how that can work. Nothing changed except for the diagram. You can also take some of their things, like cost, schedule, and performance, traditional project management, and make it look like your things. And in fact, if you're not talking about cost, schedule, and performance, you probably should be. You just talk about them in a different way. We're just putting value back into the equation. So in traditional project management, there is something on the other side of the equation. It's the plan. It's your cost, schedule, and performance against the plan. And when we move into a product mindset, we realize it's not against the plan. We actually care about the customer and whether or not we met their needs, not whether or not we met the plan. And so we just swap out value. It's the same thing. What you should be thinking about, even in Agile and DevOps, you should be thinking about, how can I increase my value? Well, I can increase my value by increasing performance, but I can also do it by reducing costs and by reducing schedule. Those are still important things to talk about. And when you start talking in those terms, again, it changes the narrative with these stakeholders that are used to talking in this language. All right, so now the big thing that comes up is the requirements process. If you're going to manage with outcomes, OKRs, I have objectives, I have some key results I want you to achieve, it really requires you to empower the teams to solve those problems and not micromanage and just hand off a software spec like, meet my OKR, here's the software spec. And so we empower teams to make decisions. We always want them to follow the principle, do the next most valuable thing. But there's a huge difference of what that is in a startup versus an enterprise, where you're dealing with complex IT landscape with many legacy interactions that you might have, whether you're interacting with them or your user is interacting with them. And so, yes, we want to utilize user research, we want to do all of the right things, but context is king here. And so decentralization and autonomy require context and alignment. And so what we started seeing is as we stood up like 10 product teams, we couldn't manage the context anymore to properly inform teams. And I say inform, right? Not to tell them what to do, but to provide them the context they need to make good decisions. About the legacy, hey, here are some integrations you're going to need to think about. Here's some performance issues when you go on that particular network. All of those contexts. Maintaining context on 5 teams is about the limit that we found. So we established product areas, usually grouped by some sort of mission capability, with another balanced team. But kind of the nature here, even if you have product manager, design, and engineering, the nature changes. So a product manager out here is practicing lean startup. A product manager here is practicing lean enterprise. And the things that you would find, so there's a great book written called Lean Enterprise by Jez Humble and some other authors. I highly recommend it if you're in kind of a leadership position. Design starts to care a little bit less about some of the visual aspects of design, which I know isn't all the designers are doing out here, but it becomes even less at this level unless you're doing a lot of combined front ends with multiple back ends servicing it. Really focusing here on user research, but also system design, which doesn't get talked about out here very often. And then on the engineering side, you start to look more like a enterprise architect. But I like to use the tagline, we still want human interactions first, so be a gardener, not an enterprise architect. It's not about dictating something from an ivory tower. It's about understanding the consequences of the decisions you're making for the people who actually have to live with them. So we do a lot of dog fooding here where we'll rotate this person team to help solve a new implementation. And there's a lot of other interesting things that you can do to keep those human interactions positive instead of ivory tower architecture. And then you start to scale even bigger. You have 20-some product teams. You group 3 of these into a system, a whole. And this is where you start to get labs leadership. And it gets really complex really quickly. And I've shown here kind of a different version of this diagram where I mentioned domain-driven design earlier. You have these bounded contexts. Well, you start to get a lot of overlapping context between different product areas in the system. And that gets difficult to manage. You have a lot of connections across these via API. And so it's really important then that, again, you're stepping up a level in your leadership, right? This is where the engineering is really becoming more like an enterprise architect, and design is really focused heavily on systems design. Also, part of that is, if you're going to do that, again, I want it to be managed with agility. I still don't want an enterprise architecture diagram that specifies all the things that a team has to do. I want them to be able to solve their own problems. And so we found domain-driven design, especially a practice called event storming, to be an effective alternative to 2 years of requirements mapping for enterprise architecture requirements, where we sit down in a room with 3 or 4 days with business stakeholders, users, domain SMEs, architects from the legacy system, and map out, create a context for the entire domain, a domain model, and a set of ubiquitous language. And you're probably going to have to break this down into multiple sections in such a large enterprise. But that is what then informs the delivery teams as they go conduct their user research, right? Points them in the right direction, gives them the context they need to make good decisions, to drive things like service blueprints and roadmaps effectively, and ultimately, yes, then the themes, epics, and stories. But if that happens in isolation, you're always just playing a game of chance. Of is this going to fit into the larger context? So again, it's not a top-down driven requirement. It's here's the context you need to make effective decisions so that when you deploy, you'll fit into the enterprise. And then finally, you have to mind the business. And this was the hardest lesson for us to learn. I'll talk about that in lessons learned. But we all have this IT context that we're talking about of DevOps and transformation, but there's an underlying business context. And really what you're trying to get at is business transformation, right? We want the business to gain value. And that involves business process reengineering as well. And it's kind of hard when you're dealing with the legacy business if they're not thinking this way, because they'll be like, your MVP, you're so focused narrowly on this one thing. But if you all of a sudden have the business, if you get them involved in theory of constraints and things like value stream mapping, it'll almost become annoying in the other direction, where in theory of constraints, right, you identify one bottleneck and you subordinate everything to that bottleneck until it's fixed. They become so narrowly focused on these bottlenecks that IT is like, man, I want to build something else. Like, I want to move on to this thing. And so really important to bring the business along and also practice lean, but maybe a different variety, right? More traditional factory floor analogy. And if you're curious, there's this whole thread on this called Deming to DevOps. Basically how Deming's the godfather of all DevOps, and every DevOps talk is basically a regurgitation of his system of profound knowledge. So fascinating thread to look into if you're a nerd like me on Deming. So lessons learned. Branding matters. I know that you all take branding very seriously, and I love that about DTE, but be really bold with it, maybe even more bold than you already are. Agile AF stands for Air Force, of course. For a long time, many senior leaders did not know what that actually stood for. But I tell you, like, aside from being like cute and fun and playful, it really says something, right? So I said everybody says they're doing Agile. So like, what separates you? People immediately knew that we were something different, right? Because there's lots of people that are doing Agile, but they're just doing the status quo. Clearly not the status quo. We're inside of the Air Force, right? So one of the most bureaucratic organizations, command and control, very serious, rigid, leadership styles. And here we are saying we're Agile. And, it sent a message to our customers that, like, hey, these guys are different. It sent a message to our stakeholders that we're different, not always in a good way. Be careful with this one. But it also sent a message to our own employees, right? I think that's really important. It drives the customer experience. It also drives the employee experience. Customer experience starts with employee experience. The customer experience is every interaction they have with your brand, every single one. Every time you pick up the phone, every time somebody's having a bad day, that's all reflected in the customer experience. And so having a really great employee experience is key to that. And branding, your brand identity, becomes as much a part of the employee experience as anything else you do. And so having this rallying cry, this thing that everybody rallied around, was critical to us being able to do what we did. Dan Ward, he's a former, I like to call him a reformed acquisitions officer from procurement. He's like a policy nerd in a good way. And I love this quote from him. He says, ignorance of the FAR, that's our federal acquisition regulation, is a greater barrier to innovation than the FAR itself. And this became like the most important thing. People would throw policy in our face all the time, and then they would actually go read the policy. My favorite example is somebody told me DoD likes to do $500 million contracts over the course of 10 years. And I wanted to break it down into 20 contracts of really small dollar values with short periods of performance. And they said, you can't do that. The FAR won't let you do that. That's just, you can't. And I read the FAR, and the line in the FAR, sometimes you have to interpret policy. You don't have to interpret this. It says, government program offices will use modular contracting to the maximum extent practical. Literally says you will use modular contracting as much as possible. And so it's a culture problem. So most of the time when people throw policy in your face, they haven't read the policy in a really long time. And it's just our interpretations or our ongoing standards around it, practices around it, rather than the actual policy. So go read the policies. Horizons of growth, right? Everybody wants AI, machine learning, blockchain. I mentioned that earlier. And communicating to your stakeholders why you're not going to start with that is actually really hard, because everybody that says blockchain gets more funding than you. And so communicating what a rational industry would do is really important. So I really like the 3 horizons. Alchemy of growth, if you're curious. But current business is Horizon 1. It's the things generating today's profits. Horizon 2 are the things that are today's revenue growth, not necessarily profits, but revenue growth, and tomorrow's cash flow. And then you have these growth options out in the future, right? Your R&D, the things that, only 5% of which are going to ever make it. And that's blockchain right now. And it's really important also that these horizons have transitions, and I'm going to talk about what happens inside of enterprises in a second here, but you have Horizon 1 here that is in execution. It moves to sustainment after Horizon 2 overtakes it. That's when sustainment should happen. Software is never actually done, but eventually new things overtake the old, and that's when sustainment really happens, and then eventually retirement. And so over time, you have these natural disruption points. Well, at Intuit, they allocate resources along those horizons at 60, 30, 10, and you're probably familiar with some of these products. But I really think it's important to also notice the metrics change across these. If you try to manage metrics-wise a product manager in Horizon 3 using, are you generating profits and revenues? Of course not. Of course they're not. And so you have to think differently about your OKRs and your metrics across these horizons. But what happens inside the DoD and inside other large enterprises is you never actually retire. And I call these zombies, right? Zombie projects that should have been retired a decade ago, but they're still in existence. And the phrase sustainment is eating our lunch comes from this, right? 80% of resources in the DoD are dedicated to sustaining stuff that we say is mission effective, but really it should have been retired a long time ago. And I think that's the case in all the large enterprises. All the users hate the software. They get mad and leave and go to procurement like I did. Nobody does that. People still think I'm crazy. And then you have these crazy things where you have like 20% of your resources being dumped into crazy technologies that everybody else is using, all these other advanced organizations, but you have no meaningful way to get them into your production environment and generating cash flow and revenues and profits. And so at Kessel Run, we actually, Intuit has 60, 30, 10. We invested a lot more in how do we rebuild our Horizon 1. Right? We're so far behind. We have to focus intensely on software that works, that gives people the opportunity to do their job, but still messaging to people, hey, we're still doing some high-level automation. So this is like digitization, automation, I kind of separate the two, and optimization through algorithms. And then we have this concept, right? And we put together our plan and our domain-driven design. What does continuous air power look like? Right? Like what's Uber for air power? If I'm a commander and I want to order some air assets, like how do I make like Uber? And communicating that vision and talking about how we get there using this Horizon model was a way for us to still get funding even though everybody else was screaming blockchain louder than us. And yes, you're dealing with a legacy system, but it's important to keep calm and don't force choke the legacy. There's this tendency to like, hey, we need to move everything to the cloud. In fact, leadership might offer a mandate, move everything to the cloud. There should be a business case for everything you do. It should always be based on value. And especially as you're doing legacy transitions, don't underestimate the number of things that aren't worth porting to the cloud. You should leave them where they are and deal with them as they are. Strangler patterns, really effective way to do that. You can do strangler patterns with or without rehosting to the cloud. So anti-corruption layers become invaluable here, but don't assume you have to move everything. Start thinking about products and not projects. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but famous Star Wars lore, there's an organization that loved to tax the entire galaxy into oblivion to build their projects. And they forgot, though, about customer obsession and real value. The rebels didn't, and they blew up that giant project twice with tiny little assets. So it's about the outcomes, not the outputs. And with that, those outputs are governed by your people, and we got to invest in people. And this is the hardest thing for people to swallow is the new pay rates. Like try paying a DevOps engineer $110K and see how long they last at your organization. It's not going to happen, but good development costs a lot. Bad development costs even more. So invest in your people, invest in enablement, and invest in good technologies. Because at the end of the day, if we have that thing, the last place that you can sacrifice, we tend to obsess over cost, but the real place that we should obsess is over performance. Because these are the denominators, right? The numerator is what's important. If this is near zero, it doesn't matter how much you drive down cost or schedule, your value is always going to be near zero. We found that there's no talent shortage. Oh, I'm so far over time. Is that okay? Okay. There's no talent shortage. There's just a shortage of environments where airmen with a growth mindset can learn and thrive. So really focus on building those environments like DTE, but how do you scale them, right? And think about the factors. I love Google's example, Project Aristotle, where we talk about psychological safety. This is the thing that the Air Force gets the worst, by the way. We're actually really good at these things when you think about it. Dependability, structure, clarity, meaning, impact, all things you think of when you think of the armed forces. The worst at psychological safety, right? Like screaming in somebody's face while they're locked up at detention, dripping wet and cold. So this is an area for improvement, I think, inside of all large enterprises, though. And if you could get this, the rest kind of naturally follows. You figure out all these problems. The other area that enterprises get hung up is structure and clarity. Org structures need to change, and how you provide clarity around the mission. If you're not going to dictate requirements top to bottom, things like OKRs, they sound great, and you're like, yeah, let's do this. And the first like 5 times you try it, you're going to fail. It's hard to implement. It takes iteration just like anything else. So, but if you have a safe environment, people figure out how to do this. And then learning the fastest is the most important thing. We always talk about technology, people, process. Yeah, obviously you want to get the best. But that's not the focus initially. It's about figuring out how to learn as individuals, as teams, as a larger organization, because otherwise the things that you buy, the people, you can't hire your way out of this problem, by the way. You can only grow your way out of this problem. So the people, the technology, and process, as soon as you buy them, procure them, they're out of date. So it's not about that. It's about acquiring the ability to learn. And then metrics are what ultimately drive customer obsession. There are people that naturally love the customer and love the business, but that's not everybody. The real thing that ensures the whole organization is rallied around customer obsession is actually what you measure. Show that your organization cares about the customer by having metrics that reflect that, or not, right? And organizations with bad metrics end up with stakeholder obsession. And that's able to happen because there's such a disconnect between the user, the customer, and the actual organization producing them. So I mentioned OKRs. OGSM is another great framework, but ultimately what you're looking for is alignment. And you can produce all the OKRs you want, but if you don't have leaders that can communicate and create alignment around them, it doesn't matter. And so I have a whole segment you can watch on YouTube. Bryon Kroger, you can search for me. I have a few videos out there, but I have one called Scale Leadership, Not Technology, about how the real limiting factor, the ceiling on your growth rate, is actually the consciousness of your digital leadership team. You can't scale beyond that no matter what. And so, yes, grassroots is where the change comes from, but leadership is where it stops. And so figuring out how to grow digital leadership is really important. I recommend these 2 books on it. I mentioned Lean Enterprise, but Loon Shots. So this is like culture. How do you establish the culture? Loon Shots is like, yeah, culture is important. Everybody talks about culture, but inside of a large enterprise, how do you deal with structure and structural incentives that are built into your organization? And I use a lot of historical examples as like a great toolkit for any leader. And then values. Values are important. Yeah, we're all trying to establish this DevOps culture, but I like to have my own personal values that I bring to any organization. And I found lessons learned at Kessel Run humble. 2 things there. 1, you can't learn if you're not humble. And I came out of operations. I was not a humble guy, to be very honest. I had my own journey to go through on this. But it also becomes problematic as you are getting success and you start over-marketing your success. And creating a lot of enemies in the organization. So being humble is really important. We learned that a little bit too late in some cases. Be fearless though. Being humble doesn't mean being meek. You're going to have to fight some tough fights and win some tough battles. And so you have to be fearless. Your job's going to be at risk. I can't tell you how many times I was yelled at, told that I was going to lose my job. I mentioned the scale that we went through, but the dollar value is pretty staggering. So when I started, we got a $1.5 million project. When I left, our annual budget was $250 million a year. And so when you're managing that much money, it's always, kind of tense. But when you're doing it in an entirely new way that nobody's used to, you're gonna have to fight your way through it. And then last, be kind, because at the end of the day, transformation involves everybody. And so there's people that aren't going to want to change. By the way, meet them where they're at. The frozen middle is not a place in the hierarchy. It's a place on the adoption curve. People just have different requirements, different thresholds to be met before they will change their mind. And so prove it to them. But the last thing that you want to do is when they don't accept the proof that you've given them is to treat them like trash, because eventually you do have to get them to transform, and they never will if you've been unkind. So yeah, transformation, kindness is the most important aspect. That's all I have. I'm sorry I went over time, but I'm happy to stick around for questions. Not offended if people have to jump.